to welcome the Revd Dr John Polkinghorne this afternoon, whose name I'm sure will be very familiar to many here through his very extensive writings on science religion. I don't think there's anybody in the world who's written as many books on science and theology as John Polkinghorne. He was previously, for many years, the professor of mathematical physics here in Cambridge, and then later on, having really done a huge amount on particle physics in that career, made a sort of sideways step into theology, ended up being ordained in the Church of England, became president of Queen's College for many years, and then since that time has been sort of retired, but not really, and has continued pumping out more books, and as I say, than anyone really has has capacity to catch up and read. I
write short books.
Short books, yeah. I was a couple of years behind. But we're delighted that John, who was also with us last night at the Royal Society for the launch of the Test of Faith materials that I was mentioning earlier, I know has had a very busy time recently, was recently speaking at the Society for Ordained Scientists as well last week, and I'm probably done a few other things in between I haven't even heard of. So we're particularly pleased that he's able to be with us today on such an important topic, theology in a scientific context. So thank you, John, very much.
Thank you. Well, I'm very glad to be here. In the last 50 years, there's been a very interesting and influential development in theology, which is the emergence of what have come to be called contextual theology. Theological reflections and insights which arise from the particular experience of particular communities. There's liberation theology, which arose in the poor and deprived areas of South American cities. There's black theology, which has arisen in the context of the experience of people of colour. There's feminist theology, which has of course arisen from the experience and insights of women. These contextual theologies have, of course, each of them had particular focuses of attention and particular problems that they wish to address. Liberation theology has been much concerned, of course, with questions of economic justice in the world. Black theology has been very much concerned with questions of racial equality. Feminist theology has been concerned with matters of gender equality in the world. They've had focused matters of concern, problems which they wish to discuss of that kind, but they've also had another character to them, which is the particular form of discourse, the particular form of expression arising from the particular forms of experience that they have. So they provide a general, if you like, setting or a general perspective in which to approach the whole theological endeavour, quite apart from the particular problems on which they focus as matters of their concern. Now, a very important and influential context in which contemporary theology is done, of course, is provided by modern science. And I think it's true to say that most of the writing, in fact pretty much all the writing in the science and theology world has had a different character to it. It has been almost exclusively problem-oriented. It has been atomized in that sense. And my own writing is as much subject to that criticism as anything else. So it's been concerned with obvious problems. Here's cosmology, modern cosmology, what do we make of that? Here's the evolution of biology, what do we make of that? And of course these are very important issues, and they've been very helpful that they have been so extensively explored. But it seems to me that we haven't really taken advantage of the broader experiential and discourse context that is natural to arise in the scientific community. We haven't treated the interaction between science and theology in that contextual mode. I was struck by this actually. The reason I've taken this up is about 18 months ago, I suppose, I bought a copy of the third edition of David Ford's massive book, The Modern Theologian. Some of you, I'm sure, will know that book. I've read the first edition. I skipped the second edition, but I thought that when the third came along, about time I had a look at it again. And so I read it from cover to cover, slogged through it. Quite a task in a way, and there were 2 or 3 chapters about science and theology, but they were quite different in character than the chapters that were concerned with liberation theology, etc. In the way they were different in the way that I've described. And I thought, therefore, it would be worthwhile to try and expand, if you like, the scope of the dialogue between science and theology, to add to it this sort of overtly and consciously contextual dimension to it. And so I've actually written a little book, another little book out for it, but it really is a little book, attainable for all good booksellers of a nominal sum. And over there, I hope, thank you very much, called Theology in the Context of Science. And I want to try and share some of the thoughts from that book with you in this talk, and then we can perhaps discuss things together. So I want to list a few things that I think are natural methods of expression, natural modes of insight, natural perspective of experience, which rise out of the context of science. And the first of these is this. If science teaches you anything about the world, it seems to me it teaches you that the world is surprising, beyond our prior powers to anticipate. I only have to utter the words quantum theory to make the point. The quantum world is quite different, as you know, from the everyday world of our direct experience. In the quantum world, we have wave-particle duality, for example. Perhaps it's the most notorious surprise in a way. Something can sometimes behave like a wave, as to say spread out and flappy, and sometimes behave like a particle, like a little bullet. Now, any competent first-year student of philosophy in 1899 could have proved the impossibility of that oxymoronic combination. I mean, pretty straightforward to do it, you might think. But of course, that person would have been wrong. We've learnt again and again that the world is surprising and doesn't fit in with our expectations. J.B.S. Haldane, who was a very distinguished biological scientist, in the late 1920s, writing about the discoveries of his physicist colleagues, said that he felt that they had found not only that the world was queerer than we thought, but it was queerer than we could have thought. So we're constantly being surprised by the world and open to that. And we have to allow reality itself, the stubborn recalcitrance of reality, we have to allow that to shape our thinking about it. That means, I think, that in the context of science, the natural question to ask, both within science and about questions outside of science, the natural question for us to ask is not, is it reasonable? As if we felt we knew beforehand the shape, the rationality has to take. As I said, nobody in 1899 would have thought that wave-particle duality was reasonable. In fact, they would think it was absolutely inconceivable. So the natural question in the context of science to ask, I think, is not, is it reasonable? But a different question, what makes you think that might be the case? Well, you see, that question is, on the one hand, more open. It doesn't seek to specify beforehand the form of acceptable answers. Quite prepared to be surprised, radically surprised, in whatever answer is proposed. But it's also demanding, if you're going to persuade me of some unexpected, strange form of rationality, then you'll have to produce motivating evidence for it. And I think that's the spirit in which I am very happy, of course, to approach my scientific beliefs, but also very happy to approach my religious beliefs, to try and seek to ask and answer the question, what makes you think that might be the case? I mean, a lot of my friends in the academic world think that somehow or other religion is irrational, that it involves intellectual suicide, that it involves commitment to some strange, weird beliefs simply on the basis of submission to some unquestionable authority, that there aren't motivations for religious beliefs. And I'm not trying to do, and I'm talking to my friends about this, to try and show them that I have motivations for my religious beliefs. I can respond to the question, what makes you think that might be the case? In a way analogous to the way I would respond to a similar question about, say, the existence of quarks and gluons as the constituents of matter. So that's the first thing, I think. We have learned that there is no single universe in which rationality has to take. We have to conform our thinking to the nature of what it is we're trying to think about. And we think of different things in different ways, and we must expect from time to time to be surprised. And if that's true about the subatomic quantum world, it would hardly be surprising, really, if it were not also true about the infinite and mysterious reality of God. That we cannot catch God in some prior intellectual, rational nets that we try and impose upon him. Closely related to that is the second thing, that there is no single, not only is there no single universal form of rationality, but there is no single universal form of epistemology either. The way we know things has to be, we have to allow it to conform to the nature of what it is we're seeking to know. If you seek to know the quantum world with the clarity and certainty that you can believe you know the everyday macro world of Newtonian physics, you will simply be baffled. Heisenberg's uncertainty principle is just inescapable. It provides an unavoidable limitation of our knowledge of the quantum world. In a sense, we can only get half the knowledge of the quantum world that we could get the everyday world. We can know either position or momentum. We can't know both together. But for macroscopic things, of course, we can know both. So again, we have to recognize that there is no single epistemology. We know the quantum world in one particular way, in its cloudiness and its fitfulness. We know the everyday world in its clarity and reliability in a different sort of way. We know persons, of course, in a third sort of way. We can put the physical world to the test, but if we try and pursue that policy in our relations with other people, we shall soon actually destroy that possibility of real meeting, of real knowledge and relationship between us. If I'm always setting little traps, if you're my friend, I'll destroy the possibility of friendship between us. And that's true of interhuman epistemology and knowing of each other. It is even more true of our knowledge of the God who transcends us. You shall not put the Lord your God to the test. It's just a fundamental fact of the spiritual world. The third point I want to make, again, is connected. These are all these different aspects of the same feature, is that we have to be ready for, because we don't have a universal rationality, we don't have a universal epistemology, we have to be prepared to allow reality to shape our thinking and to force us into what seem to us counterintuitive ways of thinking. You all know, of course, that the basic idea of quantum theory drives Dirac, my great scientific hero here in this university. Dirac formulated in a profound way what makes quantum theory different from classical theory. And essentially it lies in the existence in quantum theory of the superposition principle. In the quantum world, you can add together things that common sense would say could never be mixed together. You could have states in which an electron is a combination of being here, a combination of being there. That's of course very much connected with the uncertainty principle and the somewhat elusive character of the quantum world. And we just have to accept that way. If you don't accept the superposition principle, you won't be able to get very far with thinking about quantum theory. And that has the consequence, of course, that if you think about logic, there is a different kind of logic that applies to quantum entities compared to the everyday Aristotelian logic that applies to the everyday world. Aristotelian logic is essentially based on the notion that of the excluded middle, that there is no middle term between A and not A, no middle term between here and not here. But of course, the superposition principle tells you that in the quantum world there are an infinite number of states between here and there, between here and not here, corresponding to the different proportions in which they might be added together in the superposition principle. And that was worked out. That implies that there is a different kind of logic which applies to the quantum world, a quantum logic of a different character. Also, of course, there is this elusive character of the quantum world. That applies to all quantum entities, but some quantum entities are even more elusive than that. I mentioned quarks and gluons just now, and I worked in particle physics all my time in science. And of course, we believe that quarks, not only that nobody has ever observed a single quark on its own, but we believe that nobody ever will, because we believe that quarks are confined, as we say. They are so tightly bound together to constitute the protons and neutrons and things like that of our more or less direct experience. They are so tightly bound in them that they however hard you strike a proton with a projectile, you will never be able to knock out a single quark from within it. That means that quarks are unseen reality. But we believe, part of us believe, that they may be unseen, but nevertheless they are realities. The reason we believe that, of course, is because we believe that belief helps us to understand a whole swathe of more directly accessible experience, to make sense of that and to organize it and understand it, which we couldn't do without the quark hypothesis. Broadly speaking, there are two lines of evidence that established the quark model structure of matter. One was the structure of the observed particles. They fall into certain kinds of relationships with the other, certain multiplets, as we say in the trade. They have a certain order to them. And that order precisely corresponds, for example, to proton-like objects being made up of 3 quarks in the different combinations in which you could compose them. So it brought the immediate sort of experience in particle physics in the 50s and the early 60s was a continued bewildering appearance of more and more different, quote, elementary particles. I mean, it became so bad at one stage that people said as a joke, when you asked them how many there are, they said 92. In other words, the physicists weren't any better off than the chemists had been, which is a reductive absurd for a physicist to do. But the existence of quarks as the building blocks of these things brought an order and structure to that, which was very persuasive. That's how Murray Gell-Mann got onto that, the idea of quark structure of matter. He was always very careful for a few years to refer to the quarks as presumably mathematical, meaning, which is a sort of, I think, a coded word, meaning they might not actually be there, but remember, if they are there, I thought of them first. And he meant by that maybe this is just a mathematical trick that you can build these things up this way. But a second line of evidence was persuasive to all of us of the quarks really do exist. And that was what's called deep inelastic scattering. You had very high energy projectiles which struck, say, a proton, and which bounced off at large angles. So you had a scattering in which there was high energy and large momentum transfer. That's what deep inelastic means. And it turned out that the extremity represented by having both the energy and the momentum transfer large produced a simplicity in what's going on. You've got certain behaviors which could be immediately interpreted as, this is an area I worked in a lot myself, immediately interpreted as the projectiles striking little hard scattering centers, quark-like scattering centers present within the protons. It was a sort of rerun on a different scale of a famous experiment that Rutherford and his collaborators did in, what was it, 1912, when they discovered the nucleus, when they bounced alpha particles off gold atoms and found that some of them bounced back. Rutherford said it was as surprising as if a 15-inch naval shell had bounced back after hitting a sheet of tissue paper. And he interpreted it as there being all the positive charge of the atom is being concentrated in a very tiny nucleus within. One of the great discoveries, of course, of particle physics. The same thing was happening with the quark structure. Remember, enough of that. I mean, it's nice to talk about the old days. We believe in quarks, not because we have direct access to them, because the supposition of their existence explains great swathes of more directly accessible experience. And I think one can make a very similar case for belief in God. We obviously don't see God directly, but belief in God explains great swathes of other kinds of human experience. Explains our human experiences of encounter with the sacred, explains the wonderful order and remarkable fruitfulness of the world, and so on and so on. So it is an indirect argument, but of a persuasive kind. And theologians physicists, no apologies for belief in the unseen reality of God. Well, the latter believe in the unseen reality of quarks. And in fact, you can build up a sort of ontology, I suppose, or ontological justification in the context of science, which says that the key to reality of things lies in intelligibility. It's a line of thought very much developed in the writings of Bernard Lonergan, the Canadian Jesuit, a theologian of the middle of the 20th century, for whom the intelligibility is the key to being. And there's a wonderful, he wrote a very long and difficult and slightly showy off in parts book called Insight. And in that book, but it's worth slogging through. And towards the end of that book, he says something that I often quote, which is one of my favourite quotations. He says, "God is the all-sufficient explanation, the eternal rapture glimpsed in every Archimedean cry of Eureka." I think it's a wonderful, he was good at writing purple passages, and I think that speaks both to the physicist and the Christian believer in me. And it's just saying essentially that intelligibility, as in science, so in theology, intelligibility is the key to belief. Let me make another more general point, really, and that is in science and in theology, and in a cousinly way, I think, relating the two. What both are concerned with, it seems to me, is the search for truth to be attained through motivated belief. That's been a sort of ground-based, what I've been saying so far, but I think it's worth throwing out a bit. And it is, and I think we need to be as active and scrupulous and insistent as we can in witnessing to that in this world. I mean, there are these people who, there are, first of all, the new atheists who, in their polemical way, claim that religion is all just stupid, cloth-head, unmotivated belief. But there are also a lot of people who, as I think I've said already, who are sort of wistful and wary about religion. They would like to think that there is a broader and deeper context of understanding than science can provide, but they are wary because they do think that religion is based on submission to authority, that you are required to shut your eyes, grit your teeth, believe 6 impossible things before breakfast, because some unquestionable authority tells you that's what they've got to do. And so, of course, they don't want to do that, and nor do you, and nor do I. And I think we do have to emphasize with people that we are looking for truth to be attained through motivated belief. And if we're looking for that, we will never attain proof and certainty in some sort of unquestionable sense. In fact, I think that the word proof is a word of very limited value. Almost everything that's interesting about reality is not something that can be proved in a "you're stupid if you don't see it this way" sort of argument. I think there is a sort of, again, I'm back to this notion of a cousinly relationship between all the different dimensions and levels of the search for truth. We're all in that kind of situation. The philosopher of science that I like the best, I find most helpful and influential to me, is Michael Polanyi, and particularly his great book, Personal Knowledge. Polanyi, as you probably know, was a very distinguished physical chemist before he took up philosophy. And so he knew science from the inside. In fact, some people think if he stayed in physical chemistry, he would probably have won a Nobel Prize for it. So he knew science from the inside. And when he writes about science, he writes in a way that is recognizable to those of us who are practitioners, more lowly practitioners in the game. And he acknowledges that there is an inevitable circularity in scientific argument. There is an intertwining of theory and experiment, which is inescapable in science. Experiments, there are no interesting scientific facts that are not already interpreted facts. We have to, there's no particular interest attaches to know that with this mysterious large piece of apparatus, when I switch the switch, the pointer moves to 1.7 on the scale. That's of no interest whatsoever until I know what this machine is, what it is capable of measuring, and what that value of 1.7 might mean. There are interesting scientific facts, not interpreted facts, and it is theory which has to interpret experiment. So there is an inescapable circularity. Theory interprets experiments, experiments confirm or disconfirm theories. So it is a sort of bootstrap relationship between the two. There is no sort of archimedean point in which you can assess things without committing yourself to a particular point of view. And I think we have every reason from the astonishing success of science to believe that the circularity that this argument involves is in fact a benign circularity and not a vicious one. But it is certainly there. And in the preface to his book, Personal Knowledge, Polanyi writes, "I'm writing this book to show myself how I may commit myself to what I believe to be true." Commitment is a very important concept with science. With Polanyi, he emphasizes how science requires commitment to a point of view. Not, of course, an incorrigible point of view, but you have to commit yourself to a point of view before you can begin to do science. The idea that scientists doubt everything, which is also people sometimes say, is just absurd. I mean, it would be absolute intellectual paralysis to doubt everything. You've got to commit yourself to something, knowing that it might be false, and of course therefore open to correction. And that's what Polanyi says. That's what he said. Is how he evaluates his scientific experience, and I think that is the human condition generally, that we can obtain well-motivated beliefs, but we certainly won't attain proofs. And I suppose the most striking illustration of that is in mathematics itself, in Gödel's theorem. We all know that Gödel showed that systems sufficiently rich, and you don't have to be too rich to produce, sufficiently rich to contain the integers, contain propositions, either contain propositions which are stateable but not provable in the system, or are themselves inconsistent. No system can prove its own consistency. Now, it doesn't require a great act of faith, I think, to commit yourself to a belief in the consistency of arithmetic. Not many people lie awake at night worrying about it, but it does involve some sort of act of faith of that kind. So that even in mathematics, we don't have indubitable certainty. And in mathematics, the truth always exceeds what can be proved within a system. Truth exceeds theoremhood, if you like. So that's the human situation. And again, of course, obviously, there's a kinship. I mean, this is true. This is true of mathematics. It's true of science. It's for sure true of theology as well. But again, they are cousins under the skin. They are part of that great human quest for truthful understanding, for motivated belief. But there is no wholly privileged person who is immune to the uncertainties of that search. And connected to all this, I was saying that many of my scientific friends are wistful and wary about religion, and wary of it because they think it requires submission to authority. And it's important to be across to them, of course, I think the role of Scripture in theological argument. Many people think, actually some within the church as well as those outside the church, that Scripture is a sort of divinely dictated textbook which gives you the answers to all the questions. You just have to look them up and there you are. And quite a lot of believing scientists actually inclined to that view because they know there are textbooks and they like textbooks and like the idea of being able to look up the answers, I suppose we all do really. But I mean, the Bible is something much more subtle than that, isn't it, as we all know. It's much more like a laboratory notebook, not like a textbook. It's a record of those particularly significant and transparent events and persons through which we believe that the divine nature has been most clearly disclosed, particularly in the course of the history of Israel, the developing history of Israel, and in the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ, and the understanding of his early followers in the early church. We have to get these things across. So these are a few things that are very simple thoughts really, but they're things that seem to me naturally to arise out of the context of science, and which are helpful to take into, to me anyway, are helpful to take into account fairly explicitly in seeking to develop our theological thinking. And I think it would be a good idea to, as I say, to not simply look at the atomized problems of cosmology, evolution, etc., neuroscience, but to have this contextual thing in mind. And let me just, I've given this talk before, it's turned out shorter than I expected it to be, but let me just occupy a few more minutes before we have a conversation by trying to illustrate that the stance that I'm trying to speak about. Let me try and illustrate it by talking a little bit about how I would defend what is for me an absolutely central Christian belief, which is in the resurrection of our Lord Jesus Christ. How would I defend that? Well, I think the first thing I would want to say, would be that Jesus dies a miserable death. He's deserted by his followers. He has a painful and a shameful death of a kind reserved by the Romans for rebels and felons. He dies a death that any pious first century Jew would regard as being a sign of God's rejection. This curses anyone hung upon a tree, it says in Deuteronomy. There was a widespread horror of crucifixion in the ancient world because of its long drawn-out torturing character, but there was a particular horror among Jews because they saw it as a sign of God's rejection. And of course, two of the Gospel writers, Matthew and Mark, are honest enough to record that Jesus cried out in the darkness of his dying, cried out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Now, if that was the end of the story of Jesus, I think his life ended really in failure. However promising and remarkably it may have seemed to the crowds that he drew during his public ministry, in the end it all seems to just collapse, deserted, and he would seem, I think, to a spectator on that first Good Friday, would have seemed to be yet another first century messianic pretender, who in the end turned out to be making claims beyond those that he could substantiate. And I actually genuinely do believe that if the story of Jesus had finished there, we would never have heard of him. Or if at best it would be like those other first century messianic pretenders who were known to scholars but nobody was really terribly worried about. But we all heard of Jesus. So the first thing I want to say is one of the most striking and surprising things about Jesus is that we've heard of him, despite this miserable, apparently futile ending to his life. So something must have happened to continue his story. And then one has to ask the question what that might be. And fairly soon that's going to lead one, obviously, to looking. We'd obviously start with Paul in 1 Corinthians, the earliest explicit account of witnesses to the resurrection, speaking of Jesus appearing to this person and that person, and this crowd and that crowd, and so on. And obviously with evidential appeal intended by that, because he says that most of these people are still alive. But that doesn't tell you really very much about what those experiences must have been like. And if we want to try and get some handle on that, then of course we have to go and look at the Gospels. And when we do that, we certainly find a curiously strange and tangled tale, really. Mark, as we know, the genuine ending of Mark has either been lost or it finishes without a resurrection appearance, despite the fact that such an appearance is twice predicted in the course of the preceding Gospel. So there's not much help there. Then we look at the other Gospels, they all seem to tell us different stories. For Luke, everything seems to happen in Jerusalem, the first Easter day. Though later on, the same author, writing Acts, says it was there were 40 days of appearances, which gives us our, of course, traditional liturgical calendar. Matthew has an appearance in Jerusalem, but his main appearance is in Galilee. And John has both appearances in Jerusalem and in Galilee. And the different appearance stories are not easily reconcilable with each other. It seems a complete mess. And it's very strikingly different from the accounts that the Gospels give of the preceding last week of Jesus' life. Of course, there are differences between those accounts, particularly about the details of the trials that Jesus underwent, but there is a substantial uniformity. They're all obviously telling the same story, but when it comes to resurrection appearances, it seems a bit of a mess. So are we just dealing with a gaggle of made-up tales that people eventually concocted to express their belief that somehow or other the message of Jesus continued? Well, I don't think so. And the reason I don't think so is that despite their strangeness and variety, there is a persistent, recurrent theme in those stories, which seems to me an unexpected theme, and certainly is something you would not expect to be consistently present in a gaggle of made-up tales. And that is that for reasons that you might speculate about, it was difficult to recognize the risen Christ at first. Almost all the appearance stories center on some sort of moment of disclosure, when the penny drops, and people say, that's who it is. A couple on the road to Emmaus don't know who they're talking to. And it's only at the end of their long walk conversation, when they sit down and the risen Christ breaks the bread, that they suddenly twig who it is. And at that moment, of course, he disappears from their sight. Mary Magdalene, in John's account, thinks that Jesus is the gardener. And again, it's only when he speaks to her, that is her name, that she realizes who it is. When the disciples are fishing on the Sea of Galilee, it's only the beloved disciple who has the insight to recognize who this strange figure standing on the shore is. He says it is the Lord, and then Peter jumps over in his impulsive way, goes ashore. Most astonishing of all, and really, and striking of all, is in Matthew. Matthew, I think, is the most, in many ways, in tone, the most triumphalist of the Gospels. Nevertheless, Matthew's account of the appearance on the hillside in Galilee says with extraordinary frankness that some doubted about who that character was. So there is this recurrent theme that it was hard to recognize who Jesus was. And I don't think that would just appear by chance in a collection of made-up tales. I think it's a genuine historical reminiscence. That for some reason, as I say, we might speculate about, there was some reason it was not immediately obvious whom they were dealing with. So that makes me take the appearance story seriously. Then, of course, the empty tomb stories. What do I make of those? There are people say, well, these things pop up in the Gospels rather late. Why didn't Paul say something about it? Things like that. There are problems about the empty tomb stories. So what are we to make of that? Well, I mean, I suppose there are two particular problems. One is simply why, if it's so important, why didn't Paul mention it? Well, Paul's writing are occasional writings, and I don't think that criticism is decisive. Moreover, in that very, very concise summary in 1 Corinthians 15, he says that Jesus died for our sins according to the Scriptures. He was buried. He was raised on the third day according to the Scriptures. It seems, when you're not wasting words, and it's a very, very short passage, so it's funny to put in that he was buried, and it has suggested to a number of people, it does suggest to me, that Paul did know there was some sort of tomb. And I think it's unbelievable, really, that a first century Jew like Paul, with a psychosomatic embodied view of human nature, would believe that Jesus was alive again, which undoubtedly he did, and believe, but would nevertheless think that his corpse was left mouldering in the grave. So I don't think that's a decisive argument against it. But then there's a question of, was there a tomb at all? I mean, we know that it was pretty common Roman practice to bury executed felons in a common grave, or even sometimes to leave their bodies to be eaten by wild animals. We do know, however, that from archaeological evidence that some crucified people were buried in tombs. So was there a tomb? Well, I think there was, and one of the reasons I think there was is that Joseph of Arimathea is associated with it. He's a character of no obvious importance or significance in the life of the early church. I think the most likely reason that he is credited with this honourable and brave act, actually, of seeking the body of Jesus and burying it, was that he actually did it. So I think that there was a tomb. But I think probably the most persuasive argument about taking the empty tomb story seriously, and of course there's a good deal of consistency here between the four Gospels, differences about how many angels there were and things like that, exactly the names of the women, but these I think are unimportant variations. The most convincing story is that the witnesses are women. I mean, in the ancient world, as we all know, women were regarded as pretty unreliable, not to be trusted as witnesses in courts of law. If you were making up a story, the events are the people, I think you would make good, old, honest, reliable men the witnesses rather than women. So why are the women witnesses? Well, I think because they actually were the witnesses. I also actually think that they were the witness, given that honourable role, because I like the good old reliable men, they hadn't run away when Jesus was arrested. and so on. So I think there's motivating evidence to take these things seriously. And I don't want to lay all that sort of thing out. But whenever one makes the evidence, excuse me, whenever one makes the evidence, how you weigh that evidence will also depend upon how the conclusion it seems to be pointing you towards fits into your general view of reality and what's going on. And so there's a, so to speak, a bottom-up argument of the kind I've been trying to sketch. There also has to be some degree of top-down judgment. I mean, you cannot defeat somebody, a resolute skeptic, like, say, David Hume, who says that no story is so improbable as a dead man coming alive again. I mean, there's no answer to that. But when I try and make some sort of evaluation, if you like, of the evidence, the direction in which the evidence is pointing, I see in the resurrection of Christ a threefold vindication. First of all, it vindicates Jesus. Given his life, given his character, it is not fitting that his life ended in complete and utter failure. Secondly, it vindicates God, because God's head is on the block in relation to Good Friday. Sorry, I don't know what's wrong. I've got some dry thing in my throat. God's head is on the block on Good Friday too. Did God actually really abandon, the one person who apparently wholly committed himself to his Heavenly Father? So the resurrection of Christ is the vindication of the faithfulness of God. And thirdly, I think the resurrection is seen as the seminal event, the foretaste and guarantee within history of an event, of a destiny that awaits the rest of us beyond history, is a vindication of a quite deep-seated human intuition and human hope, that all things to the contrary notwithstanding, the last word does not lie with death. Now that might be just wishful thinking, of course, but I think there is quite a deep human intuition that's the case, that life is meaningful and not ultimately. We live in a world that is not ultimately a chaos, but we do live in a world that is meaningful in a cosmos. So these things all go together. So, I mean, of course, there are lots more things one want to say about these things, lots more detail we want to go, and I'm certainly, of course, not presenting a knockdown argument, but I think that's a kind of testimony, an explanation of belief, which is necessary and appropriate for us to seek to offer in the context of science. And that's really what I want to say, and perhaps now you can tell me what you think about all these things. So it's over to you.
Thank you very much, John. Well, we're going to have some time for questions, and we're also going to leave time for a break before dinner as well. So over to you then for questions and discussion, please. Thank you.
On the laboratory notebook,
Yes.
how does that fit in? Because science continually looks forward to more explanation and further surprises and further revelation of the way things really are. Why is it that we cut off this laboratory book, if you like, at the end of what is now accepted as the canon? There's been material lived and published since then.
Yeah. Well, I don't think we should cut it off. I mean, I call it a laboratory notebook because there is a very striking difference between any form of truly personal human experience and laboratory experience. In the laboratory, you have the power of contrivance, and you have the power, therefore, of repetition. If you don't believe the experiment, you can do it again. If you don't believe somebody else's experiment, you can try it for yourself. In truly personal human encounter of reality between ourselves, with art, literature, music, and so on, all forms of human personality don't have that repeatable character about them. Every personal experience is a unique, unrepeatable experience. We never hear a Mozart quartet the same way twice, even if we play the same disc. So that's one difference between the two. It's perhaps more like an observational notebook of an astronomer who benefits from the uncovenanted blessing of a supernova occurring in a useful sort of way. And so, and in the realm of the personal, I mean, there is you can expect, I think, the scandal of particularity. You can expect that there are particular persons, particular circumstances, which are uniquely revealing and uniquely significant. But I mean, if Einstein had died as a young man, general relativity would have been discovered eventually, perhaps more piecemeal than it was. If Bach had died as a young man, we would never have the mass in B minor. There is a sort of unique opportunity. I certainly don't think that experience and understanding and quest for truth finishes with the end of the first century. If you believe in the work of the Holy Spirit, then of course, and remember that in John's Gospel, Jesus says the Spirit is not, I have lots of things to tell you, which I can't tell you now in the Spirit, but then you can understand there'll be developing the doctrine. Moreover, how we evaluate this testimony of the past is not only, I've been concentrating on looking at the testimony itself, but also, of course, I only hinted at it at the end when I was saying about this human intuition that the last word lies with God and not with death. How we interpret it has to have some constant relationship with our experiences. Our experiences may be humdrum and different, not so profound, but there is no connection between the two. Then study of Scripture would just be some antiquarian activity, which is interesting about the ancient world, but not it. So there has to be a dialogue across the centuries. That's one of the big characteristics in which theology is different from science. Science is a synchronic subject, as people say. I don't have to read the Principia, because all that is of great value in that wonderful work is incorporated into the current scientific knowledge. Science is a linear subject, cumulative. Any physicist today knows more about the universe than Newton ever did, not because we're cleverer than Newton, but because we just 3 centuries later. In almost every other form of human activity, there isn't this linear accumulation. It's a diachronic subject, as people say. The dialogue has to go across the centuries. In religious experience, for example, there is no reason to suppose that the theologians of the, say, 16th century were inferior to the theologians of the 20th or 21st centuries. And there are insights that, that's why people like Augustine and Aquinas and Luther, etc., are permanent participants in the theological dialogue. We need the insights across the centuries. So there are differences. Thank you for drawing some attention to them, but that's part of this story.
Please, yes.
I wanted to ask you actually about your work on eschatology and the future of the universe, if that's appropriate.
Yeah,
now. Okay.
Right.
Okay, great, because you're one of the few people who write in depth about this, along with Professor Russell.
Yeah.
And I'd like to ask a quite particular question. I was wondering whether you think that John Archibald Wheeler's notion of the participatory universe, on the one hand, what you think of it in general, the notion of our observation somehow influencing the way light has traveled for billions of years in the past. On the one hand, whether you think, or how you think that squares with critical realism, and on the other, whether that could be relevant to the science eschatology debate, because it seems to suggest, if that's true, of course, if we accept that observers are somehow central, which would somehow make the notion of a universe post-existing us, well, what would it mean under that perspective?
I perfectly honestly, I mean, I knew Johnny Wheeler a bit. He was a very clever and interesting person. In his autobiography, he says, when I see a crowd going in one direction, I always go in the other. And he liked to astonish people with his ideas. I mean, I don't buy the idea of the... I don't actually... this may be a statement about me rather than anything else. I can't make sense of the participatory universe. I don't think that reflexivity is built into things. I mean, somehow or other it's suggesting that human consciousness has an important role in the resolution of quantum ambiguities. That particular answer to the measurement problem. There are lots and lots of difficulties about that. And I think the greatest difficulty is it carries this belief that no quantum process has had a definite outcome until consciousness appears upon the cosmic scene. And I just think that's incredibly incredible to believe. I think it's a clever idea, but it's to me an extremely unpersuasive idea. So I'm not very much influenced by it. Eschatology, the crucial question of eschatology really is: do we live in a cosmos or do we live in a chaos? I mean, Steve Weinberg notoriously says that the more he understands the universe, the more he finds it pointless. And I can understand why he says that, because he's telling simply the horizontal story of science, and the eventual, however fruitful the universe may be today, eventually it's all going to end in futility, in cold and dilution, and the death everywhere of any carbon-based life that there might be around. That's for sure. So it does seem in the end to be futile. And Steve, I mean, there's a certain heroic nobility in Steve's stoic defiance of that, saying that here's a little pool, self-created pool of human meaning which is lapped about by the waters of chaos and unmeaning which are all around us. It's a noble stance to take, but I think it's a mistaken one. And it's a mistaken one because he can't accept, of course, the vertical story of God's faithfulness. I think we live, if the world is a creation, the world is a cosmos, not a chaos. And that implies that the world will have to have a destiny beyond its death, in my view, and that leads one into eschatological speculations. But the reason I've written a fair amount about eschatology is that I think it's absolutely essential to a credible Christian belief. And I think it's very important that we don't lose our nerves about the hope of a destiny beyond death, either for ourselves or for the whole of creation. Because I think that's an integral part of the story. Please.
Yeah.
Yes,
John. If I may, I mean, I really like the parallel between belief in the unseen reality in theology and unseen reality in science. But I have a question about the specific example of the quark.
Yeah,
because you know, as you pointed out, I mean, nobody, including Gell-Mann, really believed in the quark until the scattering experiments were done. I mean, you know, at that point, let's say it made the transition for the mainstream scientists anyway that, okay, the quark had not been seen, but it had been seen indirectly, let's say, which is true of quite a lot of things in science, where you don't directly observe something, including almost, you might say, the atom. And I think that brings us right into the whole waters of things which are observed, but not exactly observed directly. And
well, I think lots of whatever they said in public, I think lots of physicists believed in quarks before the deep inelastic scattering.
Well, let me sort of put muscles on it.
But that's just a small point.
Yeah. I mean, and it's the whole thing's a minor point anyway. But in terms of the LHC, for example, I mean, the Higgs boson is in exactly the same situation. But why are we spending so much money looking for it? Because it's not enough that it suggests, I'd say, a framework for the other particles. We do have to have some evidence, what the cops would call material evidence. It's not enough that it makes sense mathematically.
But for the Higgs, there will be a discrete identifiable signal, which is the decay of the Higgs, which is what people are going to look for in this great spray of debris that comes out in these high energy. There'll be a spike of some sort, and which to those who know has Higgs written on it. There's no corresponding spike in quite so direct a sense for the quarks. I mean, quarks are it seems to me, I think the absolute confinement of quarks, if that's correct, and of course it's a belief, represented a new development in physics. I mean, of course things have been elusive. I mean, take atoms. Eventually, people ionize atoms, clear the electrons, or see the nucleus. The final way of establishing the existence of an entity has up till the quarks been ultimately to have an event which appears to be nakedly present. Of course, it's mediated through some signal, but I mean in a way that is pretty directly related to it. In the case of quarks, I don't think that isn't true. I mean, the deep inelastic scattering experiments are very persuasive in that respect, but they are indirect in a way that the detection of the Higgs that takes place at the LHC is not so indirect, it seems.
Could you, John, just to follow up that question, sorry, I'm
sorry.
speaking via,
yes. Yeah.
But I mean, could you make a sort of more of a, I mean, the lineup is always interesting to know how much the lineup works, isn't it, between the science and the theology on this point. But in a sense, isn't it more you have a community of people who start believing in quarks because it looks pretty likely, and but they sort of commit themselves to this pathway, if you like, of quark believers, before all the evidence is in. And it's actually as they go along, and as they commit themselves to that, and then they do a big experiment. So I suppose with the Higgs boson, even more so, you have to spend a huge amount of money, to actually get to the point where the evidence might be totally clear. So in that sense, you're starting in the community of believers, as it were, and it's through that community you actually then experience more evidence yourself. I'm coming to the theology now, which it sort of then is self-reinforcing or reinforcing in other ways. I mean, is that, do you think you want to go that far in making that kind of analogy, or is that going too far?
But of course the evidence might not be forthcoming. I mean, if the deep inelastic experiments had turned out to be something different, there'd be no substantial deep inelastic scattering, for example, then the quark theory would have died a death. We have to be careful on the notion. People rebuke me if I become unduly cautious about the notion of critical experiments. But there are things which do either seem to tend towards strong confirmation or tend towards strong disconfirmation of previous hypotheses. And that's what I'm simply saying is that by and large it is the. I go back to this slogan about intelligibility being the key to belief. It is by making sense of great swathes of directly accessible experience that we believe in hidden entities of one sort or another. Now, quarks are more hidden than anything else. God is more hidden than anything else in another realm. So I think I don't want to push these analogies too far. We have to be careful about them, but I think there is some degree of analogy there, which it's honest to maintain.
Thank you. Yes.
Just following this theme, back to theological reflections on scientific progress and so on. Just two thoughts which I think theologians haven't sort of really interacted much with. One is the unreasonable effectiveness of science. The fact that the way this sort of takes off in some extraordinary way. So just over the last few years, here we are sitting on this sort of minor arm of a galaxy and as this carbon-based life form, and we seem to have worked out, the origins of the universe, the Big Bang, the nature of our DNA. This explosive growth of. So there doesn't seem to be much theological reflection about why that has happened.
Well, there's quite a bit actually, and I've written quite a bit about it myself. It's one of the arguments of natural theology to say, why is science possible? Why is mathematics so unreasonably effective at unlocking the secrets of the universe? Is it from purely science exploits those remarkable, and they are remarkable facts. Science exploits them, but it doesn't explain where they come from. Sure. And many of us would feel it isn't enough to just shrug your shoulders and say, gee, that's a bit of good luck for you chaps who are good at maths. It works out that way. The universe is astonishingly rationally transparent and astonishingly rationally beautiful also in relation to that. And these things aren't, I think, explained by evolutionary biology. Of course, our brains have been shaped by evolution to understand the world around us, but quantum theory is quite different, and so on. So I think there is a very serious argument there. It's not a knockdown argument. No arguments natural theology are, but to say. But I think the reason that science is possible and mathematics is unreasonably effective, ultimately, is that the universe we live in is a creation, and we are creatures made in the image of our Creator. I mean, there's a theological. That's an example, if you like, of theological insight making something intelligible, not in a knockdown way, but making it intelligible, which might otherwise seem to be just an extraordinary brute fact or a happy accident.
Can I just do?
Yeah, of course.
Yes, of course. But it also leads to the idea that, in a sense, the universe is a set-up job. That the whole thing has been set up in a way that it could be explored. So that firstly. The other thing, which sort of is the other side of that, and that is the hiddenness of God. That despite this extraordinary ability to see our way back to the first microseconds after the Big Bang, etc., 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 that in some other way, all these people who are doing it, so many swathes of them don't see God in this. So, do you have some reflections on those things?
Well, I think one can see that one can see that if creatures are truly to be free to be themselves and to make their own choices, then the infinite reality of God has to be to some extent veiled from their side. So we will be overcome as finite creatures by encounter with the infinite reality of God. So I think we're going to see why there has to be a degree of veiling. You might say then, well, you know, could do it perhaps a little less veiling. Then you could argue about the degree of it and so on. But I think the fact that the universe is not full of things described made by God, for example. I mean, I think I can see that God works in more subtle and discreetly respectful ways of making the divine nature known. And of course, all religious traditions, and Christianity in particular, believes that God has acted in particular ways, in particular persons, in particular times, to make the divine nature known, and that's a possibility and a potentiality which seekers after truth have to be willing to explore.
Yes, please.
Yes, can I ask you a question about you made several statements about rationality, epistemology, logic, and you have this coming out of this modern physics. Is there a danger that you might fall into relativism simply?
Into
relativism in a kind of religious sense as well? And do you think there might be an argument for some kind of meta-rationality that somehow brings together these different, seemingly contradictory positions, something like Chesterton's paradox or something?
Yeah, yes and no, I think is the answer to that. My instinct, both as a scientist and as a religious believer, is to seek ultimately some unified form of knowledge and understanding, not by coercing, not by the technique of Procrustes, of cutting off things that don't fit into my preconceived bed of rationality and explanation. And at the end of the day, I think the true theory of everything, to use that highly contentious and hubristic phrase, the true theory of everything actually is theology. God is the ground of everything. Theology has a sort of dual role, it seems to me. Theology is one of the particular sciences, in the sense that it is investigating a particular sphere of human encounter with reality, encounter with the sacred. This is science, physics, is our encounter with the physical world, and so on and so on. So there's that sort of level. But theology also can operate as the sort of grand integrating principle. That's the sense in which it still is, I think, the queen of the sciences, for those of us who want to see it that way. Not because the queen tells everyone what to do, but that the insights of all the different disciplines and inquiries are integrated in a single great scheme. Now, obviously, theology is not wholly successful in doing that, but I think that's one of the attractions, if you like, of a theological point of view. But it has to be pursued in open and submissive and accepting relationship to the insights of the individual sciences. But I think that will, whether undoubtedly, the sort of, there will not be a common rationality of a simple sense. There may be some great integrating rationality which is in the mind of God, of course, there is, but that's we don't have immediate access to that.
I think we'll take one more question, if there is one, and then... Sorry, yes, please.
Yes, I'd like to continue on the previous question.
Yeah, sure.
So if you want, there are different perspectives, and we would love to have some coherence in the end that brings this together. But how do we solve the friction points that present? And particularly, I'm quite interested in one friction point, which is divine action. Like, as a religious person, as you said yourself, I assume that God at certain points shows things to us and intervenes in the world, while science shows us a world that is mostly based on a kind structure in which things behave more or less the same way all the time.
Well, I don't think you're quite right about science there. Science. First of all, a merely mechanical view of the world, of course, died with the 20th century science. The recognition of intrinsic unpredictabilities in quantum theory and subsequently in chaos theory. Whatever the world is something more supple and more subtle and more interesting than mere mechanism. Moreover, science's account, we have pretty good understandings of processes in certain well-defined physical domains, but we have very patchy understanding, an inadequate understanding of how those domains relate to each other. For example, quantum theory and classical physics, the relationship between those, how the everyday world emerges from the quantum world, is certainly not understood. There is a measurement problem in quantum theory. There is the fact that chaos theory, for example, is incompatible with quantum theory, because quantum theory has a scale set by Planck's constant. Chaos theory is fractal and has no scale. The two theories can't be put together, despite the fact that chaotic systems soon depend upon a level of detail which is below Heisenberg uncertainty. So science has and then there is, and moreover, science in itself is not sufficient to determine answers, even within given domains, on complete answers to the nature of causality. For example, everybody agrees that quantum theory is indeterministic. Sorry, not everybody agrees that quantum theory is probabilistic. Is it indeterministic, or as Niels Bohr and co would say, or is it deterministic with hidden variables of a sort of Bohmian type? That's a question that can't be resolved by science itself. It requires metaphysical decision. So I mean, I won't take science absolutely seriously, but science has certainly not established the causal closure of the world on its own terms. And I think that there is no reason to believe that there are not. Of course, the exchange of energy between bits and pieces, which is science's form of discourse about process, is part of the story, but I don't think it's the whole story. I think we have every reason to believe that there are holistic powers of agency at work in the world. That I, for example, have the power to act as an agent to raise my arm. When I do that, of course, there are bits and pieces, things happen, currents throw the nerves and all that, but I decide as a person. And if we could act in the world as agents, I think it would be very surprising if the creator of the world cannot also act in the world. God, I believe, interacts with creation, but doesn't overrule it. So there's some combination between what God does, what creatures, what agents do, what natural processes do. I don't know how to strike that balance. It's the problem of grace and free will, now written cosmically large, and that's notoriously difficult to resolve. But I think we can believe in a God who interacts with the world in a discrete, I mean guarded way. I don't mean a punctuated way, but not in an arbitrary interfering way or a sort of celestial magician way. So I think that we have to be very careful to evaluate what science really tells us, and though it's wonderfully successful, it's not quite as successful as some of its most ardent people claim.
I think we'll probably, thank you very much. I think we'll probably just stop there to give people a chance to have a break before supper. I think that'd be good. I think we really want to thank John for a fascinating talk. So